Hi, everyone. I think we are going to start now. Some people might be coming in a little bit later, but we should get going. So thank you so much for attending our Another World is Possible event today on abolition and justice in the South Asian community. I'm Nishma, and I will be chairing today's event. My pronouns are she, her, or they is also okay. I'm a gender rights and access to justice advocate, and as well as an anti-oppression facilitator, trainer, and organizer. I work in the UK and in India, and my practice and interests lie in improving the formal and community-based systems of justice for survivors. So we're really excited about today's conversation, and we're happy to have you with us. We're going to start to make sure we don't run over. And yeah, so please can I ask everyone, I think everyone already is, but if not, can I ask you to put yourself on mute just to avoid echoes? And if it's available to you and you're comfortable with it, to switch your video on. I'm sure it'll be really nice for our speakers to be able to see you and see who they're in conversation with today. And also, please feel free to edit your name in Zoom to include your pronouns if you would like to do that. And you can do that by clicking the 3 dots over your picture and then just clicking rename. I'd also like to just remind you that we're recording. So if you want to rename yourself or change your photo for that reason, please feel free to do that. The recording will be put up on our Facebook page within 24 hours, and it will include closed captions as well. And okay, so for those of you who haven't engaged with us before, the Rights Collective is a group of South Asian individuals who are looking to tackle the distinct and often subtle ways in which disempowerment, inequality, trauma, and harm manifest within the South Asian diaspora community in the UK. I'm going to hand over to our speakers in a second because I want them to do most of the talking rather than me, but I just wanted to share a few things about today. So please feel free to use the chat as much as you like to interact with one another, and also contribute to the conversation, ask any questions. Chandrima, who's from the Rights Collective team, will be moderating the chat, and she'll be collating any of your questions so we can ask the speakers closer to the end. Also, if you agree with something someone is saying, but you don't want to interrupt them, in real life, we would obviously nod our heads or do something like that. But in the digital world, that's sometimes a bit hard to register. So what we do is we use the plus sign in the chat. So the more pluses that you use, the more you're supporting the person. So feel free to do that as much as you would like. I also want to remind people of our community guidelines. So by attending this event, you've acknowledged that you're here to learn, unlearn, be challenged, inquire with curiosity. So just to keep that in mind, really. And we have a strict zero tolerance policy against any form of harassment or bullying based on any identity during the session. And we really like this space to be one in which we can speak openly about our experiences and also interact with one another respectfully. And finally, if you'll be posting about today's event, feel free to tag us at Rights Collective and use the hashtag South Asian Radical Visions. And Habiba from our team, who's on the call, will be retweeting and sharing whatever you share. So please feel free to do that. Moving on to the event itself. So this year, for 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence, we're hosting this series of conversations along the theme of Another World is Possible. And we're exploring and imagining possibilities for our future beyond the current interlocking systems of oppression in which we live. And we just want to thank and name and be grateful for Black and working class and Dalit radical thought and critical inquiry, especially from women, which leads the way in this kind of imagining and building a better future. And we hope that these conversations will allow us a little bit of space to also imagine our role in that as South Asians in the diaspora, in creating that kind of liberated world that we want to see. Today's event is exploring abolition and justice as it relates to the South Asian community in particular. And we have some really, really amazing speakers from the UK, from the US, and from India. So I'm really excited to hear more from them and hear from their perspectives. So I'm going to move swiftly on to invite them to kick us off by introducing themselves a little bit. And in particular, I'd like to ask each of you if you can share a little bit about your entry point into abolition, into these alternatives to the state justice system, whether that's restorative justice, transformative justice, community accountability, whatever you might relate to. And if appropriate, it may also be helpful to hear, I guess, how you define some of these terms for yourself, so people can kind of engage with that as they move forward. So I'm going to hand it over to Hajira first, and then followed by that Kamardeep, and then Deepika and Sujatha. You can just move through without, I'll try not to interrupt.
Great, thank you, Nishma, and thank you so much for the team for inviting me. I feel really honoured to be invited. I feel like I have so much to learn from the other speakers as well. So just a bit about myself. I organise with Nidra Manoj, which is an independent campaigning organisation that aims to educate, empower and organise Bangladeshis and Bengalis in the UK. And I also organise with Abolitionist Futures, which is a collaboration of community organisers and activists based in the UK and Ireland who are working together to try and build a future without prisons, police and punishment. But a bit more personally about me, I grew up in an estate in East London, which was primarily working class, brown and mostly Muslim as well. And before I even knew what abolition meant, I grew up with a distrust in the police. We'd also often see young boys being roughed up by the police for what appeared to be no reason. And yet actually when someone was actually seriously hurt and you called the police, they often wouldn't turn up. I also grew up hating the immigration system. I've got uncles myself who were turned away from a life that was almost by luck afforded to my own dad and therefore myself. And I'm sure many of us have witnessed the horror of raid vans, especially for me in our local local train station. We often used to get raid vans turn up, and just feeling completely helpless as they used to drag people away, not knowing what would happen to these people afterwards. So all in all, I knew how the existence of a police state did not protect people. It certainly didn't help protect my people. And in fact, in many cases, it made it worse, especially in cases of relationship violence, child abuse, drug abuse, all of these things that I was experiencing in my life. And the police state did not help in any of those areas. I started to really campaign, I guess, when I was at university. But even at that time, I was focusing on things such as surveillance programs, Prevent being one of them, racism, immigration. And that's what then led me to expand and formulate my abolitionist thinking. And it was done most concretely when I worked with, almost by accident actually, with Abolitionist Futures to organise their 2018 International Conference on Penal Abolition. And that conference basically brought together activists from around the world. And it really expanded my thinking and helped me formulate some of these experiences into theory. And it's just the fact that there's a lot of work and campaigns already going on to tackle all these different things and all these different experiences that I had. In terms of alternatives, I think it's interesting because I haven't myself been organising in one particular alternative. So I won't go into too much about the different things and what they mean to me because it has been primarily based on theory and reading. And I hope, as we're discussing today, maybe we can go into that a bit more. But one thing I am, I guess, particularly interested in is how many of us do have community infrastructures available. So whether that be multi-generation families or communities of worship. And of course, I understand how none of these are perfect. But I have anyway, in recent years, seen how the state has actively undermined and destroyed these structures, especially in the Muslim communities through things like Prevent. In favour for more punitive state sanctions. So I'd love to, in these discussions, kind of just delve into that a bit more and talk about it a bit more. Yeah, that's me. Over to Kamardeep.
Hi everyone, I'm Kamardeep. I'm based in California in the US. And so to describe a bit of my background, I have been working in women's rights. Working is not quite the right word, kind of everything, like working, living, volunteering, whatever I could do particularly around addressing gender-based violence. So specifically for me, that's meant trying to understand and prevent family violence and sexual violence. And that's really kind of what led me to the journey of understanding abolition and and transformative justice. So I kind of came at it from a different space where I was learning a lot about how it's addressed in the US, and most nonprofits and agencies work with this pretty closely with the state and the police to address the violence in the communities. And that was basically how I was also trained. But what you ultimately realize is the more closely you work with people who are trying to escape the violence is that rarely does the state or the police actually help them, or does it actually work in a way that addresses their problems. It's not really set up in a way to support people who are going through this form of violence. And oftentimes it's not even an option. What I also came to this because, you know, just witnessing it in my, you know, in my extended family and my own family, seeing how violence plays out and how the police are never actually an option or something anyone thinks about when they're thinking about trying to end harm. So recently in the past few years, I've been working more and more with survivors of sexual violence, and that's where a lot of people have been seeking, a lot of people I've worked with have been seeking options that involve some form of restorative or transformative justice. They don't necessarily want to press charges, they just want some form of apology. And so that's what brought me here. And from a like more personal and philosophical standpoint, part of the reason I've come to abolition is I really don't think that anyone is disposable. And so that's really what drives me. So one of the questions that Nishma asked is, how do we think, what does abolition mean for us? And I would say that's a big part of it for me, is that people are not disposable. And I also see abolition as a positive thing, not necessarily a negative thing of getting rid of state systems, but more of how can we build and strengthen the community structures that Hajera mentioned. So that's me, and I'll pass it to the next person.
Thank you. Thanks, Nishma, for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here. Hi, everyone. My name is Deepika. I'm right now in India. I'm a queer feminist and a gender studies scholar. I run an online space called Alternative Justice, which critically engages with punitive and individualistic approaches to sexual harm and how they're linked to the internal logics of the castle state in India. I'm also a police and prison abolitionist, and what that means to me, especially in my context in India, is recognizing that police and prisons do not create safety, they do not reduce violence, but have been historically known to continue to perpetrate violence and torture on marginalized bodies. And the criminal justice system, in fact, condones and even sanctions police brutality and custodial torture upon them. So for me, and I'm sure for a lot of us as well, some of the very foundational ideas about abolition were introduced by reading Davis's work and how she understands abolition as not simply a movement to do away with prisons, but about cultivating accountability and justice in our relationships, in our communities and institutions, so that we don't have to rely or resort to state-based policing in prisons. And that, although, you know, sounds very simple, it involves a lot of work. So as a survivor of sexual harm myself, but also as someone who enjoys caste privilege, it is important for me to have this conversation to talk about, you know, the everyday experiences of violence of queer, trans, Dalit, Muslim, and other marginalized communities who, you know, don't have the luxury or the resources or the networks to just simply litigate their way out of violence. And part of having this conversation is also thinking about alternative strategies that are based on restorative and transformative justice approaches that are mindful of the needs of survivors of sexual and gender-based harm, and you know, work towards offering what is required to redress that harm in a way that the criminal justice system never could. So how I arrived at thinking about alternative strategies was really during the Me Too movement. Although I've been a survivor of sexual harm much before that, but something about that moment where whether it was conversations with friends who have been harmed or even friends who did harm, made me reconsider my foundational beliefs and ideas around justice, to realize that, no amount of punishment can repair the very complex and multi-layered consequences of harm. I never really got the opportunity to make my abusers encounter how they had harmed me. So, to know about alternatives like restorative justice, especially, and, the support of practitioners that actually help support that part of healing was a very radical concept to me. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. Thank you. Over to Sujata.
It's a joy to be with all of you today. Really, this gathering and this discussion really makes my heart sing. And I think it's related in no small part to sort of my entry into abolition and restorative and transformative justice as a very personal story. And so yeah, I'm too a survivor of child sexual abuse, grew up in rural part of the United States in Pennsylvania, and we were the only Indian family for miles, and I was the only child of color in my school, and I think I learned very early on that the systems were not designed to protect me. And so when I think back on why I never asked for help, I knew that the solutions that were on offer were not what I or my family needed. I didn't want my father incarcerated. I didn't want potential immigration consequences for my family. I didn't want to be taken away from my akka and my amma, and that none of these were things that were healing to me. To be placed in a family that didn't speak my language, eat my food, practice my religion, none of this was appealing. So, later in life, when I was a survivor of other forms of sexual and intimate partner violence, including rape, I again found the systems to fail me. The few chances that I had to actually potentially engage with the system, my first encounter with police in discussing, a harm that I'd experienced, just their first questions were about the race of the person who harmed me, and it was a South Asian person, and I saw immediately that all of my male friends were about to get surveilled by the school police department, right? That I was in the university, and I was just completely disinclined to be a part of all of that again, and so. I became a victim advocate and was frustrated during those years in victim advocacy. And I don't think that I put it together at that time, that it didn't make any sense that I was trying to push people into something that I myself never chose to do, which was to engage with those systems, right? And I went so far as to apply to law school to become a prosecutor. I thought that I was going to be a prosecutor. And all along never believing that locking people up was the right thing. And so I almost dropped out during my first week of law school and was advised by a wonderful criminal defense attorney professor to consider becoming a defense attorney who defends women who killed their abusers, because I was quite interested in the death penalty. I didn't believe in it. And so, but I didn't really know how to make sense of all of this. And in part, he advised me that everybody he'd ever represented when he was a death penalty lawyer himself had had a childhood that was similar, if not a million times worse than mine. And so that was really interesting. But, over my years, I did ultimately become a defense attorney, defending all people, regardless of whether they had caused and or experienced harm, where I got to see over the course of some time the failings on all sides of our criminal legal system. And so during those years, I started to go to various opportunities to experience restorative justice experiences as well as trainings. I did learn from Western trainers who learned from Indigenous people and at times appropriated Indigenous peacemaking methodologies. And so to that end, I wanted to learn more directly from Indigenous people, Maori, Tlingit from the Yukon, Diné, which is people call Navajo. And during those years, I also became quite curious about what were the roots of restorative justice in our own diaspora communities, right? Where might we have things to learn from Panchayat, from Jirga, and how might those things need to be updated in a way that attends to other structural oppressions that have existed for many, many years, even within our own communities. I also learned a great deal from Mennonite people, who I don't put in the same category as like appropriators, but rather really digged into their own spiritual histories in order to find what they call a covenant justice, which led them to restorative justice as well. So, you know, in real brief, what really drew me to restorative justice was how some Mennonite thinkers framed these three questions, this paradigm shift it called my heart to, which was, instead of asking what law was broken, who broke it, and how should they be punished, restorative justice asks who was harmed and what do they need, and whose obligation is it to meet those needs. And so while in the Western context, that obligatory nature of things is often framed as an individual responsibility, as a South Asian, I very much felt that in a collective sense, in the sense of interdependence, in the sense of community that I learned in all of those summers that I spent with family in India every year growing up. And you know, and I think my work today is very much in the work of face-to-face, producing opportunities for community-based, face-to-face dialogue and participatory decision-making, particularly in the context of sexual and intimate partner violence. But for about a decade, I spent time trying to circumvent the criminal legal system for youth of color who are charged with felonies here in the United States. And it really comes down to this feeling of we got us. I believe that that's something that we as South Asians in particular know how to do. Sometimes we experience it as the nosy auntie. I have been known to be that nosy auntie, and I mean it only in the best ways. But I think that, just briefly relating it to abolition, you know, I think, again, it's been said so beautifully already that, you know, to my mind, incarceration is simply relocating and caging harm doing and often exacerbating it, not ending it. And so to my mind, if I care deeply about sexual violence, then I have to care that about the rate of rape that happens inside prisons as much as I care for those outside. And also, you know, from a really practical perspective, nobody I know has called the cops, especially Desis, like nobody. And the data backs that up nationally, even including those who are well supported by the system. 50% of survivors here don't contact the system. Of those who do, 20% say it made them less safe. 20% say it maybe made them safer, and 30% say it was a wash, right? And so this system, from a very practical perspective, is an abject failure, and the nascent data we have on restorative processes is much better. And so I would just like to solve the thing, and so and heal the thing. And so that's what draws me to these things that we call alternatives, but I think really are at the root of how we've always known how to heal what we've got going on.
Thank you so much, everyone. I think there was so much in what you all shared, and you all started to link your journey in with, well, I mean, a lot of your journeys obviously start personally as well in terms of your personal experiences, and situating that within our communities, and if part of the diaspora, then as part of the South Asian communities in those countries, in those places. I guess related to that, what I wanted to ask was, well, actually, first of all, if I could ask Hajira, if you feel able to share a little bit more about Prevent, just a little bit, because for people who don't know what that is, and maybe just contextualize, I guess, what abolition means in the South Asian community here in the UK, and our relationship with carceral systems here, because I know you've done organizing around that, you've done thinking around that, especially in the context of London and East London and communities here. So it'll be great to hear just a little bit more context, I think, from you before I open it up to other questions as well.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I should have gone into it a bit more. But yeah, just in summary, so Prevent is now part of a legislation, like it's legislative, but it has been around for many years. And I think a lot of people kind of think it was put in quite recently by the Conservative government, but actually was created by the Labour government many years ago. And the idea is essentially that as a community, you can prevent terrorism by stopping it before it even happens. But the problem with that is you're stopping something from happening before it happens. So you start accusing people and assuming things will happen. So it really does start to criminalize thought. So if you look at, and now of course it is it's become it's part of the legal system, and it's something that is enforced upon people who work in the public sector. So talking about your nursery teachers, your primary, secondary, university teachers, your doctors, your mental health care providers, anyone who's meant to quote unquote protect you is also meant to be doing the role of watching you and trying to figure out if you're going to become a terrorist. And of course, the training that they provided around that is it's very problematic. So it covers things like, do you have poor mental health? Do you suddenly change your friends? Do you suddenly dress a different way? Do you have interest in politics, or are you against the UK's foreign policies? Things that many people, including myself, probably tick every single box. Or you do at some point, everyone changes friends or changes the way they dress at some point or another. So even the, I guess, the advice that the government has given to these public service people is very problematic. And it's something that everyone from academics to the students and many people have been campaigning against it, but the government has been very firm that they know what they're doing, and it's rooted in some kind of science, but they've never published what science is based on. So it's that's prevent, I guess. And sorry, forgive me, I forget the second part of your question.
Oh, it was just then around, I guess, your organizing, especially in London, in your community. And I guess I can open this out to the bigger group now as well. I was just thinking about what wisdoms, if any at all, do our communities already hold around justice outside of the carceral system? And is there anything we can learn from that, or is too much of that, or is too much of that rooted in harmful behaviors and harmful ideas? And I know you all have thoughts on that, so I'd love to hear from everyone.
Kamadip, you're unmuted, do you want to?
Oh, yeah. I have a few thoughts. One, I think it's pretty complex. So some of the things that I've noted coming from the Sikh community is that we often have to address hate crimes since we're a pretty visible minority. And we work pretty closely. What I've seen is a lot of the, wherever it happens in the suburbs here or in other cities, when it happens, we work pretty closely with the police. So that's been, as an immigrant community coming in, there is this in the US, there's the concept of the model minority and, being the good minority. And of course, part of that involves working well with the authorities that are established there. So, but what I've also noticed at the same time is a lot of times these hate crimes happen, the community that's involved, the Gurdwara that's involved doesn't press charges. They often want the person who's caused the harm to come in and to learn about Sikhism and to do community service. So there is this inherent understanding of what harm means and how it happens and what's the actual way of addressing it versus not sending them to prison or pressing charges. It's less punitive. There's an understanding that punitive responses don't work. And I think it's because the hate crimes often target, they might target one person, but it's really the intention is to target the community as large. And so when the community comes together to think of what the response should be, it's not about this one person did this one thing to another person. It's more what was the intention? There was a recent hate crime over the summer in a suburb here with an elderly Sikh man who was walking on a walk, and I went to one of the community meetings, and of course they were working closely with the police, but the people who also spoke, the elders that spoke at the meeting, were saying let's consider the background of the people who caused the harm. There's a lot of economic inequality here. and, you know, and like what created the circumstances for this person to cause the harm. So I think there are like, I think, you know, there's spaces for us to build from, to like pull those out and make them stronger, and that's already within our culture and the way we are interacting with each other. So that's just one point.
I love that example, actually. It really, I wish we had more of that here, because it's amazing. And to me, that just embodies what I see as abolition, like communities working together to see the harm that other people face that then causes them to do more harm, and try and solve that, then just be like, yeah, lock them away and in a prison somewhere they'll magically get fixed somehow. And also the fact that I'm just thinking in London, in the UK, there's been like a massive push to legalize different elements of hate crime, be it sexual abuse, racist abuse, or like Islamophobia, and trying to get that stronger laws, I guess, against it. There's definitely been a lot of campaigns to strengthen the legal system. And at the same time, there's been, I've noticed, especially from more activist grassroots groups, a campaign to stop the like strengthening of these legislation, just because ultimately, I guess there's an understanding that having more laws will not protect anyone. But it's interesting how that is that, I guess, different balance, and it's often from a very, I don't know, from what I've seen anyway, it seems to be people with certain privileges who probably the legal system does offer them more protection going for the more legalization. So like a lot of white feminists going for certain elements of sexual abuse being criminalized, like being able to look up someone's skirt, like that being seen as a formal type of illegal criminalized harm, whereas other activists, usually people of color, like I've seen arguing against it and saying, you know, we don't need to legalize everything, which is interesting. It just made me think of that.
So I was just thinking of responding to what you said, Nishma. Is also something like a conversation we've had earlier. Because I think when we say, sorry, community-based, we need to think about what we mean by community, you know, especially in our context in India, where caste is this overarching system of discrimination and oppression. And community has a very different meaning altogether over here, right? One of the foremost barriers that Dalit survivors face in getting justice, apart from dealing with law enforcement officials, is the Khap Panchayat. That is actually a very powerful institution that routinely perpetrates a violence of its own. And Dalit activists actually demand for limiting this form of community intervention in cases of sexual violence against Dalit women. So we need to be really mindful of you know, when we propose systems that are community based in our context. So the works for me in thinking about community is actually agreeing with also what Mia Mendes says when she you know that it is actually our pod, our support system, people we can rely on who form our support networks. But at the same time, I also think about whether that translates to, you know, in the case of Dalit women and or trans people, especially, having to always rely and only rely on other Dalit women and trans people. Do our pods also only end up belonging to certain social and economic backgrounds, where those that are more privileged and persuasive are also those that are able to easily access support services? You know, and I think in the Indian context, it is also firstly important to understand how the discourse on abolition that exists, that's very US centric, you know, can't be simply replicated in India. When we speak of the American prison industrial complex, or think of demands like defund the police, what does that really mean to us when the police force over here is overburdened with work while simultaneously being highly underpaid. So what are our specific demands? Although I'd still like to point out that I live right next to the largest prison complex in Asia, which is the Tihar jail, and it is actually slowly turning into a prison factory. Where the private sector has actually started outsourcing goods, profiting off of and exploiting the labor of prisoners, most of whom are under trials, and giving them less than standard wages. In 2012 or 13, the Tihar jail factory, which is run by its inmates, actually recorded a turnover of 32 crores or something. So we need to think about what our specific strategies and demands are when it comes to abolition. And in order to arrive at that, I think we also need to have a conversation on the complicity of the state and the criminal justice system that has let a disproportionate number of Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi, and Muslim individuals just languishing in prisons for years. And most of them are actually under trials. We need to talk about police brutality against minority communities here, especially against trans individuals, and also critically look at the ways in which our current government has used, the pandemic as an opportunity to police who is allowed to protest, who can say what, who can raise their voice, all of which is deeply tied to one's religion, one's gender, ethnicity, and caste. So to speak of abolition in India would require us to really flesh out, what our end goal is, rooted in our specific context and how we plan to get there.
I really appreciate the naming that, simply outsourcing the US's approach is not at all the way to go. I would say both with abolition and with restorative justice, and with transformative justice as well. I think that everything is going to have to be homegrown, and that we should look to each other both as sort of, what calls to my heart from over there, and what are the huge cautionary tales? And I see the US as primarily a massive cautionary tale. It breaks my heart to hear this about the industrialization of Tihar. When at one point there was an aspiration towards Tihar becoming like a big Vipassana center, and now it's like a place where people are doing prison labor. That's the trajectory from the enslavement of African Americans towards mass criminalization and mass incarceration in the United States. It's worrisome to see that the same thing is happening to Muslims and to transgender people, to Dalit folk, in India. And so, how do we keep our eyes open to these sorts of things is really important. But I think you'd frame the question more from, or I will try to answer it from a more positive perspective, because I can go down lots of rabbit holes of like, don't do this and don't do that, and this has been a fiasco. And, so what do we have? And I alluded to it briefly before. Within us diasporically, as well as, I think in the homeland, there are some characteristics that I think, without essentializing us, and I have to be very careful to not do this as an immigrant, and to look back with nostalgia, right? Where the transgenerational harm in my family began there, right? And so it's not, I don't want to be too rosy about this, but there are some things that I think that if we approached it with sort of some optimism about how we can access some of these gifts we have, notions of interdependence, or the existence of intergenerational wisdom, right, which is like critical to effective restorative processes. If you don't have grandma in the circle, like, it's not going to be a good circle, generally, is what we've learned. And so that, you have to go find grandma, or nobody talked to grandma, nobody cares if grandma's alive or dead, is a problem that I often have. Whereas I don't see that so much in South Asian contexts, right? Like, there is literally people sometimes feel an excess access to intergenerational engagement and involvement, but that is huge for the successfulness of, I think, any restorative or transformative process, to the degree to which it is possible, right? I get that I have tons of queer Desi friends who, we've had periods of time in our lives where we've had to be out of touch with huge parts of our family, et cetera. But I remain optimistic that this is something good for us. I think, Also just other things, again, not to overly idealize it, just the bare awareness of a third gender, and the non-binariness that exists within the notions of gender in South Asia that come comfortably, I think, on some fundamental level that has clearly been damaged through colonialism and maybe fundamentally always damaged in some ways. That seed is there of an ability to erode notions of us, them, victor, vanquished, good, bad, like the kinds of binary thinking that stand in the way of what I think is a true healing justice. That same mindset that makes it so easy to put somebody in a prison is harder if you learn to think along continua instead of thinking in binary ways. And so that the ability to hold two truths simultaneously, these sorts of things, I think, fall into that bucket of, we got us, like we've got some good bones here for building something beautiful within our community. So that excites me. And I think, but I think here in the US, while our diaspora is much more complex and diverse than we think it is, people tend to focus in on this excessive successes, particularly in the Bay Area and in finance and in tech. And who gets drawn to the United States and why, and particularly who and when, I think are particularly, and speaking entirely of myself and my own lineage, right, a really colonized bunch in a lot of ways. And so we would really have to do a lot of work to decolonize ourselves, to rid ourselves of our cherishing our caste privilege, things of that nature, is some fundamental work that I think needs to be done in order to be able to tap into those gifts that I think are also there inherent in us. And so from my side, just a personal experience I had with a restorative justice process that was astoundingly successful was a Fijian, Indian Fijian Muslim. It was a mosque that was experienced a hate crime, and that entire community was the first one to say, we don't want those African-American and Latino boys who attacked the mosque to go to prison, and facilitated a dialogue with 40 people, many from the mosque, as well as the 4 children who were charged with a felony hate crime and their families, and that, walking away from that experience and seeing how receptive and open everyone in that mosque was to that restorative justice dialogue. And it wasn't just because it wasn't taking care of our own, right? They were actually engaged in a restorative process with children and families outside of their own direct community, and with whom there had been quite a few problems in that area. And so that really just, again, doubled down my belief that we got us, like we know how to do this, we have what it takes. It just needs to be properly resourced. So I'll just share that briefly.
Thank you so much. I was just pausing to see if anybody wanted to respond to anything, but I really wanted to say thank you, Deepika, to bringing up this point about caste, and it really makes me think, and I know we discussed it previously as well, about class in the UK context, and like even Hajira, the experiences that you shared right at the beginning, and the first thing I thought was, there's such a class element to those experiences, even within the diaspora, within the South Asian diaspora. And it's not something, like Sujatha just said, it's not something we want to recognize. And there's so much history behind our migration patterns, the reason why we came here, and how that manifests in our different lived realities now, right? And therefore also manifests in our different relationships to carceral systems, to the police. And, we can't say, I don't think, that there's this one, or there's even like that much of a similarity in our experiences as South Asians with the police. I can for sure say that there are people in my community who regularly rely on the police and have a completely different relationship to the ones that you described earlier. And I just wanted to bring that up. And if you want to comment on that when you speak, that would be great as well. And then the second thing I just wanted to share, because it relates to what Deepika said around community and what do we mean by community, right? And this is not my quote. Actually, I think Sujatha said this when we spoke for the prep for this call, that community doesn't just happen, it's something that you build, right? And I just wanted to throw that out there because I thought that was so powerful, because community is at the base of so many of these alternative systems of justice that we're talking about, if we want to call it that, I think there's something in that, right? There's something really important to discuss about that, especially when we, as South Asian diaspora in particular, but also in homelands, we talk about community so much. And I think it's important, as Deepika said, to interrogate what does that really mean, right? And what is a pod, as you mentioned, with respect to Mia Mingus's language. And I guess the question I want to throw out in relation to that, but you can comment on anything anyone has said or that I have said, is when we think about alternatives to the state justice system, what we've seen, there's often this desire for it to be really perfect and have all this data behind it and have all these success stories and just, that's the question I often get, like, oh, okay, so what's the alternative? You're an abolitionist, what's the alternative? Explain to me, tell me the model and we will apply it, right? And I just want to throw that out there as a question, is what do you want to say to that? I guess what do you want to say in response to that? What thoughts come up when someone says that to you? And whoever wants to go first, it doesn't have to be any particular order, so whoever feels called to speak.
Just checking, no one clicked on me. Thank you, Nishma. I think you mentioned loads of interesting points and really did tie everything that everyone said really well together. And I can just say, I just really love the where you ended with, Sujata, about how the stuff that we do isn't properly resourced. And I think that's the crux of many of our problems. Where do our resources go for the criminal justice system? It goes to policing, goes to prisons, and it doesn't come to people who know what they're doing. So in answer to the question that you raised, Nishma, about what is the alternative, I think everyone here has already described an alternative, like a concrete example of what alternatives can look like, in terms of building relationships and learning together and like healing together and not relying on having to throw people in cages. But I often get asked this question from family and friends more so than strangers, actually, like when I'm talking about bits and bobs and they'll be like, okay, so what do you think you're going to do? Well, I often get the question also, so if you're dying, are you not going to call the police? Like, no, I'll call an ambulance. Why would I call the police at that time? But I think people often think we need a perfect alternative, not remembering what we have right now is not perfect. So let's look at the stats of what we have at the moment. And just because of it's what we focused on, I guess, already, like in terms of rape and stuff. So often people ask me, so what about the rapists? What are you going to do about that? And like, almost everyone that I know has been sexually assaulted in some way, even if it's not rape. But I actually don't know anyone in my personal life who has not been abused in some way. And those kind of crimes have not been convicted. And the state that we have, the amount of money being pumped into prisons and police every single year, more and more every single year, has not stopped those crimes from happening. So it doesn't make sense that we should just continue how things are going and just think one day we're going to put enough money in, so it's just going to magically fix everything. When actually what we see year on year is crime rates go up. The prison population gets bigger, but doesn't mean we're safer for it. And just on rape specifically, because I remember looking this up, in the UK anyway, the rape conviction rate is only 3%. That's assuming everyone who got raped actually went to the police and said, I got raped, and they managed to. So only 3%. And then people who go into prison, there's a massive cases of rape in prison. So yeah, like Sujata, you talked about it earlier, like what do we do about that then? If prison is a solution, why is it causing more harm? So I guess I like to flip it up to them. Like alternatives do exist if you want to look for it, but is this really alternative? Like you want to just keep the status quo as it is?
I just want to ride off what Hajira was saying. And one thing I like to do, and I might have done it with a few folks here before on a different call, is like I like to ask people to imagine, or not imagine, but just remember like some of the worst pain that's been caused to them. And not because I'm trying to have them revisit their trauma, but because in those moments, I doubt anybody thought like, let me call the police. like that was probably never anyone's first, second, or even third thought. Like, and you often, those places of like harm and like those are with personal relationships, so you would never even want to call the police. And I think that helps reframe it of like, okay, this is like, these are not abstract situations with this like imaginary you know, evil person who like goes like monster. It's like, these are real life situations that happen to all of us, and sometimes the harm can be really bad. Sometimes the harm is really hard to classify in a criminal justice system that wants things to fit in really nice categories. You know, like when I think about sexual violence, it's on a spectrum, right? It's not always just like the idea of like rape is not just like one thing. It can be like a lot of sexual harassment, a lot of unwanted attention and touching that leads to even more harm. But the criminal justice system is not set up to address any of the stuff that happens before. So are we supposed to wait until it escalates? And does the stuff that happens before not matter, just because the criminal justice system can't handle it? And oftentimes, like, so I just try to reframe things that way to have people think about it in those ways. It depends on who I'm talking to, because some people come really like defensive when you say you want to get rid of the police. And then I think, Nishma, you asked about building community and what that means. I think that's a hard question to answer as an immigrant, because you know, like when I talk about community, I talk about the Sikh community, but like I'm not in every Gurdwara, and I'm not part of every Sikh community across the US, but I do feel like personally, you know, very personally attached to whatever happens in those spaces, even though I might not know anyone there. But in terms of building like community in my immediate space, Mia Mingus she has worked a lot with folks on building this idea of what she calls pods. So you have like specific small groups that address specific things. So you could have one that is like, you ask people to hold you accountable. If you've ever caused harm, you can go to them and they can talk you through it. You could have one for like helping you hold you while you're healing from harm. You can have pods for like anything. It could even be for like, the 5 of us are going to learn about transformative justice together. So I think, you know, building community does take work, and I am inspired by that idea. And one of the things that I just finished up a course with Mia Mingus, like a few months course, and one of the things that I'm inspired to do, and I'm hoping to get off the ground with Nishma actually, is starting a small pod of South Asian folks who are trying to address harm within our families, particularly abuse, because what we have available to us, or what I've had available to me in my experience, has been, especially in the West, is like you completely cut off contact, and there's no middle way. It's either you put up with it and you just sort of like, you know, oppress yourself and suppress who you are, and if you want to continue the relationship, or you completely cut off contact, and there isn't really a lot of options if that's not what you want. So so I think in terms of building community, it's like how, you know, being intentional about it, and from an abolitionist and transformative justice perspective, building community with others who want to figuring out how you can manage conflict and harm and abuse together, and not hold that alone, and experiment together.
I think to answer your second question first, I think the state's justice system isn't perfect either, and there is a lot of data to support that. You know, alternatively, I would also say that the justice system is actually working perfectly as it's been designed, which is to oppress, to police, and, you know, operate with this inherent suspicion towards marginalized communities. So I don't know why we would rather expect perfection from alternatives that actually try to remedy that harm. than be actually really furious about how the justice system re-traumatizes survivors by making them, recount the violence inflicted upon them and subjects them to a great level of scrutiny and blame and shame. So it is important for us to, I think, explore these alternatives because for a survivor of sexual violence, the crime itself isn't the only harm that is endured. They also have to go through the violence of the police, who may or may not, file their complaint. Then come the doctors and the subsequent medical examination, followed by other inadequacies in the legal infrastructure. The laws on sexual violence in India don't even recognize the rape of a Dalit woman as a caste-based atrocity, and not just simply as a gender-based violence. So, creating transformative spaces that are both anti-casteral as well as anti-caste, that foster healing and support is not only important, I think it's also absolutely urgent. And like Kamaldeep said, it is hard work. And I myself really don't know how to answer that. But for me, I think, put very simply, it begins with practicing self-accountability. I think that's where one can really begin. Personally, accountability work is terrifying work for me because I've always been kind of very scared of admitting to being wrong, to making mistakes. I think that sort of culture has never been fostered, even within my family. And I come from a family that enjoys a lot of caste privilege. That's absolutely right wing, and where there's never been a question of admitting to doing wrong. There's never been, it's just, we've never apologized to each other. We've never even acknowledged that we have harmed each other. So for me, I think where the work that I do with alternative justice, for me, it also begins with first practicing a lot of those principles myself in my, in my personal life. Trying to be less punitive towards myself, trying to abolish, my punishment mindset before I actually go on to address, some really serious harm, some, sexual violence related harm. So yeah, that's what it is for me.
I feel that everyone said what I might say. I would just add that I've was influenced maybe about a decade ago or so by my former co-worker Nuri Nusrat to stop using the term criminal justice system and to start calling it the criminal legal system. And it's important, I think, to call it the criminal legal system because that's what it is. We call it the civil, we don't call it the civil justice system, but, and so, and it is legal. And what I'm reminded of often was that in Nazi Germany, there were many things that were legal as well, but wildly unjust, right? And so I think that it's a very useful term to play with in your own language. I think another thing in terms of language that I really think a lot about is labeling language, and I try to remove it from my mouth as much as is possible. There are many indigenous tribes that I get to be with who don't use the labels, or even their entire language structure is radically different from ours, which is incredible. Like just such a linguistically different thing that is actually more about relational, and there are no like nouns in a traditional sense, or that instead of saying there's a woman over there, you would say womaning is happening over there. And it leaves this possibility of change at all times, right? Or there's Sonia Shah, my friend, who's also a sister survivor, longtime friend, and runs the Ahimsa Collective, just doing an amazing job of creating community in a restorative justice context with formerly incarcerated people, crime survivors all coming together. It's not Desi specific, but there are a lot of Desis involved, which I think answers part of that question. I mean, there are just a ton of Desi abolitionists out there. And I would say that the leadership in Desi abolition really does come from Dalit folks here in the US. And I think it's really important to name that, really thinking about the brilliant work of Equality Labs and their international connectedness around the struggles of both African Americans here in the United States and Black people the world over. And so I think that that's something really important to think about. But I confused myself there. I went down a very important rabbit hole. But just the brief of it being that language was where I was. Sonia wrote a wonderful report on restorative justice, and in that report, she interviewed someone from the Nizga Nation, who said that the word, instead of calling someone an offender, the terminology is unhealed. So, you know, and one of my mentors, the former Chief Justice of the Navajo Nation, says, instead of the word offender in Diné, they say the phrase that is used to describe such a person is acting as if they have no family. And that one moved me so deeply because it made me think about my father and his abuse. And this makes me cry every time I think about it. When he was sexually abusing me, he was acting as if I wasn't his daughter. He was also acting as if he didn't have a good family name to uphold. He was disconnected in diaspora from, you know, it's interesting. And I know that sexual abuse is rampant in India. And I know in my own personal experience that in India, it was the only place I was safe. My father never touched me during the 4 months of the year we spent there. And I felt that there was something solid about that family structure that he came from, so what does it mean to be acting as if we have family? And so for me, that's what really starts. And what is family? You know, as a queer person myself, there was a period of time in which I had to develop a notion of family, you know, my friends who became my family, and the trepidatiousness with which I came out to my South Asian friends. And so my family isn't all speaking my language, right? And then I know that the Bengali food that I've learned how to cook, and the Odia food that I've learned how to cook, and the who, you know, it's not all konkani cooking in my kitchen, because the people who embraced me and the people who put me, and I got to wear my sari, you know, on my wedding day, Gujarati style, because the whole konkani world did not show up for my wedding, right? And there's sadness in that, and there's beauty in that. And what does it mean for me to have such an incredibly diverse South Asian experience, you know, here, that my best friends are Muslim and Pakistani, and, you know, all of this is a real blessing about community, but also hard. And so, you know, I think it's important to hold the pain of that living diasporically in what we lose. In what we used to be called ABCDs, right? American born confused Desi is what, you know, we used to call ourselves back in the day. And I think that there's some truth to that, and there's also like a blessing in it.
I love that ABCD.
Oh, sorry, go on.
And I just wanted to say thank you so much for sharing that, because that was actually really powerful. Yeah, and it touched me, definitely. I also just wanted to, when we talk about community, we often get like these rosy, warm feelings, and it seems like something's amazing. But the more I've thought about it, especially recently, it's made me realize that sometimes it's over romanticized. And with this word, like when we think of community, I personally, and I'm not talking for anyone else, sometimes hide behind that, like, yeah, we have a community, and because it has these rosy, over romanticized feelings, sometimes the work isn't put in to actually build that community. And yeah, I mean, it's been touched upon already, like actually work does need to go on to build communities. But when it's not, it really does show, like when you have solidarity, meaning like just falling apart completely. Especially like, I'm just thinking in the UK context, where the South Asian communities primarily, as far as I understand it, and I haven't looked into it a lot, but my understanding of it, you know, you've got the Indian community, the Pakistani community, and the Bengali community. And the Bengali and the Pakistani community are often working class, and any of the indices that you look at, usually, especially women as well, so there's other breakdowns into it, but especially Bengali and Pakistani women are often like the most, the least educated, the most face the most amount of poverty and all of these things. And then you've got the Indian communities who are often one of the richest minorities in the UK. So completely two sides of the spectrum. But when we talk about communities, we are just lumping everything together and assuming everything's okay, and not actually, I guess, holding each other to account and teaching each other, I guess, and learning from each other, and then making sure we actually are building these solidarities, and just not assuming like, South Asians are just know and we're okay, when actually South Asians is made of many layers and different groups. Not to say that all Indians are like very pro-police, by the way. I realize I very much watered that down. It's definitely
no, that's okay. I think you made a really, really strong point, and I think this happens across the board. And we've seen with this point has come up last week in the first event in this series, and even in the prep for next week's event, where we're just talking about the flattening of the South Asian experience, and not, exactly what you said is just on point, right? Like that's exactly what we see across the statistics, and what even is community across those identities and others within the South Asian space, right, in the diaspora. But I just wanted to say thank you so much for this. The language point was so powerful, and I really appreciate that was brought up. So thank you. And then I think all of you kind of mentioned this point about and there was a question about it as well, actually, around community, and are we idolizing that, and what does it mean to build that community? And there was an example that Deepika gave around apology and apologizing within her family, and it made me think of my family, actually, because I literally just sent them a joke yesterday, like a video, which was about like how South Asian parents apologize. And it was like things like giving you food after an argument, or like fruit, I think it was fruit, giving you fruit after an argument. And there was a list of things, and it was funny, but at the same time, it really made me think about how are we say community, and we use the word community so much, but what does that really mean? Like, are we really building something relationally, or is it just labels, right? Back to the language point, is it just labels, like, oh, we share the same label, so we're in community? Is that really what we mean by community when we say it in the context of justice and relationships and abolition? I don't think it is, and I think all of you kind of touched upon that a little bit, so I think that's really interesting. I just saw comments around chopped mangoes, but the question I wanted to, I guess, ask at this point was, I guess, to pivot a little bit. And just from what I know about all of you, and either the work you do or the thinking you've been doing, I'd love to ask, what are some of the small, what I'm going to call small experiments that people might do in this context? So around abolition, around building relationships, around building pods, like many of you have mentioned, around challenging ourselves and our own thinking in interpersonal interactions, around restorative circles that me and Deepika actually participated in one of a series that she was hosting. I'd love to hear just what you know about that people can take away from this, but also things that you've been doing, whether that's professionally or in your activism work, or whether that's personally in your interpersonal relationships. I think that would be really amazing for people to hear.
No one's going first, so I'll go first to break the silence.
I actually think everyone's being really polite to each other, I've noticed.
So then it's like silence. Yeah. Does someone want to go first? I'm happy to go. I'll go to break the silence. So for me, I think a big thing is learning, recognizing that the work has gone on for years and years and years. Abolition is not a new thing. Certainly not in the US, because we all know it's not a new thing in the US, but not in the UK either. Like even things that wouldn't necessarily be labeled as abolition, but like we had race riots, even before the Stephen Lawrence case, there was back in, I think it was the 60s, where race riots managed to get recognition of institutional racism within the criminal, what I've already forgotten, not the justice system, the criminal legal system. So it's important to know these cases. And so for the way I'm doing that is joining on creating reading groups, doing the readings, and just learning, watching different things, attending things like this to learn. And then I think breaking can be really scary and overwhelming. And sometimes I do feel really overwhelmed by, like, when you just think about the number of things that are wrong in the world, from homelessness to like all these different things that are wrong. Just thinking, what can you do? And it can, for me anyway, sometimes it just feels like, oh God, I just sit in bed and do nothing. Because it just gets really overwhelming. So I do really like to just break it down into what are the things that I'm most passionate at the moment, and what can I do about it, and what are people already doing about it, so I can build around that. So examples being, like, recently I just saw a campaign's gone up on like no more exclusions in schools, being like a really powerful campaign that school kids are doing. There's been examples of, like, of course, like new prisons being built that campaigners are stopping, or like, you know, whatever that small campaign is. I mean, I know I've chosen quite a big campaign, actually, not small examples, but there are small things that you can do, even if it is. So what me and my husband have recently tried to do in our state that we live in now, it's highly gentrified, and there's a lot of cases of people like passively aggressive messages in the WhatsApp group. So I created the WhatsApp group thinking we'd build community. It didn't go that way. People would passively aggressively message like, oh, someone's left the bins not properly, or someone's doing this or someone's doing that, and it's turning quite negative. But I guess creating the WhatsApp group was one step, and then now, like, actually meeting your neighbors, getting to them to know each other, then your names and faces. So we've had like video chats and things since we can't meet during COVID. So it sounds really silly, like meeting your neighbors, but actually I hope, and my big dream is that if we know each other, we won't call the police on each other, and actually if we hear something's going wrong, we'll knock on the door and check, are you okay? You know, those kind of things. So it can start with your neighbor.
Yeah. I was going to say, it doesn't sound silly at all. It's so powerful. We think this is small, like getting to know our neighbors, but who really knows their neighbors in London? Exactly. I know we're both in London, so just asking that question. I live in the suburbs and we still don't hardly know our neighbors, right? So I think it's such a powerful point. I think it's really important, actually, that we don't build those kinds of relationships or as much, and so making that point is actually important. Sorry, I'll back to whoever.
No, so that was it, really. So
I think with regard to, you know, abolition, I think we're just so early, and I think we are very, I worry about immigrant communities feeling that we need to remain in line with the place that we've come to. And I've noticed this unnecessary excessive expression of patriotism, right? And I think about all the pictures of the Sikh folks with the turbans made out of American flags after 9/11, and sort of, you know, and again, there's zero judgment about this. This is not my life, and I don't judge what people have to do in order to, you know, align themselves with the state that they've relocated themselves into in order to be safe. So I get it. And at the same time, this standing up against this monstrosity that is this mass criminalization in the United States is scary for immigrants. And I think we have to be really honest about that. I think we have to take baby steps in some ways and not have too high of expectations of people who are literally at risk. And I think that we have to think about how that risk plays itself out differently across communities, right? And I think that starting with Muslim folks and moving from there to also folks who are perceived to be Muslim, right? And what does that mean? And also like darker skinned folks, and, you know, the only police murder that we have of an Indian person who was quote unquote in the wrong neighborhood was a very dark skinned grandfather, right? And so, you know, and the police felt bad that they accidentally thought he was Black, right? So what does that mean? So what does that mean for us to hold those truths when we think about saying it's time to stand up against and speak out against a thing, you know, because the constant refrain that I've heard my entire life, if I've been critical of anything in the United States, was that I could just go back to India. I was born in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, right? And I experienced abuse in my family, and there was nowhere for me to go back to. And plus I'm American, period, right? And so and so that's a real challenge, I think. I think we have to really hold that. And so I think that the baby steps that I take is that for some reason I got blessed with this ability to not keep my mouth shut about things that are dangerous for me, right? And I think that that comes a lot from my own caste privilege and my own educational privilege and other things that have allowed me to run around and tell people I was queer in the, you know, late 80s and early 90s, and run around and say, you know, this whole system is garbage. And it also comes from having been born here, like they really can't send me somewhere else, right? And then my father passed away, so there was no fear of him being locked up if I told the truth about, so I have all these protections, right? There were horrible things and there were protections. And so I think that the work for me personally is to do as much public speaking as possible. And as many Desi spaces as I'll be invited into, which aren't very many. But there are places like API Chaya, and, you know, and then they invite me back to do like a restorative justice training, and then I get to be in beautiful community with those folks, right? Or Apnagar in Chicago. Like, what does it mean to start to bring restorative justice into those spaces where there's openings? And so that's been my work, is a lot of public speaking, a lot of, you know, if I'm asked to keynote the National Sexual Assault Conference, I'm going to do it in Asari, you know, and what does that mean to signal that I'm here as they see, and that we can actually be visible for those of us for whom it is safe to be visible and questioning, that, you know, and again, I really want to like quadruple down on the amount of privilege I have to be able to do this. The first and foremost to my mind is that my father is no longer living, which is devastating to me, and simultaneously what allows me to not be afraid for the consequences. And I literally would check what were the statutes of limitations on failure to protect, like who can come for my amma if she, you know, apologizes for having not protected me, like what are the consequences? And now we're all safe, and so then I get to do this. So for those of us who are safe to do this, I think it's important to speak up and speak out, and that's an important part of leveraging my privilege. It's not easy, but it also is easier for me than for others, and so I feel blessed to be able to do it.
I think I mentioned my thing about a little bit earlier, which is why I was hesitant to speak first, about trying to put together a small group, maybe 6 of us, of different things we're trying to do in our families. And I think I just like it's more intuitive for me to work like in relationships with people. So I don't have like any broad grand visions of like, this is how I'd like to fight the big system, but I do see like, you know, like I've had a lot of success in having changes happen in my immediate family, but it was really hard and I did it alone. And I see how quickly some of that gets overturned when my extended family gets involved, because I haven't been able to do that work with my extended family. And the social pressure when you involve more people, like more, basically for my family, more Punjabi people into the conversation, then it's hard for them to not revert back to like what their expectations of how they should be are like. But on the same side of things, I think, yeah, I think like being able to build community with other people who hold similar viewpoints to me is one of the ways I've been thinking will make this stronger for everyone. So finding like this group right here, all of us who are here right now, having relationships with people like that, talking to people like that, building intentional projects or ideas together that we can try together, or leaning on each other, I think will make things, I think things will come out of that. You know, like I think I mentioned on the prep call we had, there's a few groups of people who are in the US who are organizing, they're called South Asians for Black Lives, and they held a defund the police webinar on Father's Day. I invited my dad to that and he actually listened. So and he's pretty conservative. He voted for Trump in the first election. Like, he's not someone you would think would go to a defund the police webinar, but he walked away being like, yes, we should defund the police. Look at all these things that they're doing. And it helped that, like, it was, you know, South Asian people putting it on. It helped that his daughter invited him. So I think, like, there is this, like, when I think about how to engage in community, like, having this openness that can be hard to have sometimes, of like, people you think wouldn't care or would be really hard to do this with, and actually may be very hard to do this with, can actually change. And so having some level of optimism and hope, and I think that's why it's important also to do it in community, because it can be hard to hold that alone. So you know, like this, inviting my father to this webinar, probably 5 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to like even think that I wanted to do that and like engage with my father in that way. But things, you know, are different now. I have more community that I lean on, you know, like whether it's my roommates or people like in this group like Nishma. So I think that's like, in terms of small experiments, I think, you know, building, I'm going to borrow Mia Mingus's languages of pods of like building these small groups of people that you can lean on for specific things or learn with together. And so that's why I want to try this small group of South Asian, mainly women, who are going to try to see like different interventions within their families. And those interventions could be like, we haven't even started the group yet, but my idea is like, what I've seen a lot from, what I've learned a lot from reading about transformative justice and engaging with my family is like, storytelling is so important. So getting my family to share their stories. And oftentimes it's just, and maybe it's partly because of you know, the story of migration and the immigrant experience of like, you just have to make it and survive, and they just never wanted to talk about anything. And so that also means like, it makes it really hard to talk about anything hard, whether it's a current thing that where there was a fight or conflict, and you know, because it's become almost this like habit to not talk about difficult things because that's how they survived. So that's like one of the experiments I want to try within the group. There may be other ones too that we all come together and think like, I'm going to try this thing with my family. Will you all support me in this way? So that's a smaller experiment. Trying to think if there's anything else. Yeah, and just there's, you know, I'm like lucky to be based in the Bay Area. There's so many groups that are organizing around defunding the police or getting the police out of schools and things like that. So I just show up and try to support all of those things, whether they're holding a rally or doing a city council call.
I actually don't have a lot to say about this, but I think there's self-accountability for me, which I already spoke about. It's also about, you know, when I read about how accountability is not something you take from someone, but actually also involves building relationships, even with abusers, which was initially such a uncomfortable, you know, idea to me. It reminded me of this conversation I had with a friend, you know, who had been called out during the Me Too movement. And I had to really think about whether I want to be associated with an abuser. You know, I had to take that call in that moment. But I was, and this is a while back, I didn't even know the terminology, the language of, you know, restorative justice. But I was surprised at how I responded, or rather restoratively in that moment, before I even knew what RJ was, right? You helping him encounter what he'd done, the harm that he'd caused, and acknowledging it was really like, it really surprised me that I was able to have that conversation with him. And so that's also part of building relationships within communities for me. And there's definitely baby steps, like Sujata said. Also for me, it's really, you know, to expand who I interact with, who is in my circles. And I do that consciously. I try, at least, so it doesn't just become an echo chamber of people, you know, from the same backgrounds and caste and class privilege talking to each other. Yeah, and that's really hard to do. yeah, and a lot of us spoke about our families. And even in my family, speaking to whom about caste, for instance, is always not very pleasant. It's absolutely, there's a lot of gaslighting involved. There's a lot of yelling and shouting. But I recognize that by speaking up, as the only person in my family who speaks up against these issues, I actually end that cycle of harm. It stops at me, and this is a realization that I got through my therapist, which was really important to recognize that actually, yeah, I am actually the only person who speaks about these things to my family, even though, and not to kind of dismiss, that it also involves a lot of trauma and damage to the relationship. But I at least leave them with, this tinge of doubt, if nothing else. So yeah, there are a lot of small steps, and yeah, a lot of reading, and how Nishma also mentioned restorative circles. They were so powerful. Just interacting with a lot of people, and for all of us to kind of come together in this space where everyone trusts each other enough to just share about, bits about their lives. That's been just so powerful. So for me, it's also about creating those spaces and being in those spaces. And in the past few months, that's really, really helped me grow a lot. Yeah, I think that's what I can think of at the moment.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much, Nishma. See you all soon.